All right, we are live on Facebook. Hey everyone, Eric here again, and I got another Eric. He spells his name completely the wrong way. He spells it with a C. But I've been working with Eric for a while now on my own personal real estate deals, and I've been very, very happy working with him, and he's just been fantastic to work with in a lot of different ways. I've worked with him both as a franchisee working with landlords, and then as a landlord, I used him to help me with my agreements as for my retail center. So he works on both sides. I'm on both sides of the deal. And as we get started on the questions in this Facebook Live today, I first want to provide context to look at things from the landlord perspective and the tenant perspective. And I think as I see a lot of stuff going on out here in general, people have very strong opinions, and most of us only see things from our own perspective. And if we would just take a step back to try to see things as an employee or as a landlord versus just us as a business owner, I think we would make better decisions, and it would help us negotiate better as well. So Eric, thanks for coming on here today. I know that you've got plenty of things going on right now, and you're quarantined in New York, right?
Yeah, I'm quarantined here in Jersey City, so just outside of New York, but thank you for having me. Always good to see you, and I hope everyone's doing well in your neck of the woods.
Oh yeah, we like I'm driving tractors and like building fences and riding bikes, and then doing things like this, like just trying to get in and actually just help people. So franchisees out there, if you know other franchisees, get them into this group. We want to grow this group. I have questions, probably about 12 questions from another thread. But if you have questions for us, for Eric specifically, drop them in there. Michael's online right now, and he'll help make sure that your question gets answered. But Eric, as we get started, why don't you give us some perspective on what tenants are going through right now, which most of everybody on here is a tenant, and then what landlords are dealing with as just an overall context before we get started into the Q&A.
Sure. Well, I'll say what I think everyone listening probably already knows. There's high levels of anxiety. There's high levels of concern coming from the retail, from industrial, from all levels of tenants across the country. I recognize that people's businesses have been put on hold. You need your business in order to pay your rent. And everyone's looking to us because, all I do, a lot of my practice is leasing, as you know, Eric. And I touch all types of leases. I work with people over the country. And the concerns are really the same everywhere, which is basically, how am I going to pay my rent? Now, I've probably actually spoken to more landlords over the last 10 days than to tenants. I work with lots of landlords, lots of very big landlords here around the metropolitan New York area. And they're getting the calls from you and from all your associates and all your colleagues in the franchise world. And there's a lot of fear on the landlord side as well. Landlords need tenants. They need everyone to survive this. They don't want to put people out on the street. And they have the tax collectors calling them, and they have their lenders calling them, basically asking, are you going to be able to pay your mortgage? And so there's a lot of fear on the landlord side as well.
So just know, I think I just want everybody to know that going into it, because it's easy to look at a big landlord that is a REIT and think they've just got endless supplies of money. I can just not pay my rent for 3 months, and that's not my problem. That's their problem. But it's really everybody's problem, right?
I think so. And I think a few things, what we talk about today might not be applicable tomorrow. We just don't know. It's very fluid. We don't know what the federal government's going to do. We don't know what state governments are going to do. Just in anticipation of this conversation, I did some research just here in New York City. I looked at Los Angeles. I looked at San Francisco. I know there's local anti-eviction moratoriums in place right now. That does no one on this call very much good, because I know that what we're all thinking about is coming out of pocket today, April 1st, May 1st. Do I have to pay my rent? You know,
Yep.
the eviction question is something that we could get into, but I don't know that that's as big a concern for everyone.
I think someone had someone like, we'll go down the dark, dark path later on, and I do want to go there, because I do want to ask the questions like, what happens if I just stop paying my rent? What happens if I just close up the doors and walk away? So we will get to questions like that and go down that dark path as kind of worst case scenario. But there's really two most common ways that people are negotiating rent today, or trying to negotiate rent. Can you give some perspective on that?
I will. And before I go any further, I just have to make my one lawyer comment. Which
no, we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that.
I need my one lawyer comment, which is that, you know, this is a conversation. Everybody should be encouraged to look at their lease documents. You know, we negotiated those for a reason. Call up your attorneys, be a squeaky wheel, get everyone on a phone call, and get into the real details with your professionals. I'll give you kind of what I'm seeing with my clients, with you, but everyone's circumstances are their own, right?
Yeah, that's true. And there's little subtleties within those agreements that I mean, that's just not an attorney saying, I don't want to be responsible for this. There's the little things that your attorney negotiated. And I went to Eric on things that I worked with him on, and then other attorneys that I worked with on with other projects. So make sure that you do that. Because I emailed you the other day, on one of my partners emailed you the other day about some stuff in our lease specifically, and then that's how you and I followed up again to get you on here. But with that said, what are the kind of the two common ways to negotiate rent with your landlord?
I think the two common ones, which a lot of people are already going to know, would be to get the free rent holiday right now. So you're not paying your rent until X happens. Maybe the virus subsides. Maybe depending on what state you're in, maybe businesses are allowed to reopen. And then that non-paid rent, the question is, what happens to it? I'll tell you now, it's not going to be forgiven forever. That's not the intent. Lenders are not going to agree to that. Landlords are not going to agree to that. So I don't think, from a tenant perspective, that's where our head should be at. I think our head should be, what will provide me the most reasonable sort of opportunity to get my business up and running again, in light of the fact that I just had to close for 4, 3, 5 months. One of those ways would be to put all the rent on the back of the term. So and
this is probably the most ideal. If you could do this, this is the best of the two.
I think for tenants, you want to put it all on the back end. If you have a 60-month term and you get 4 months of abated rent, that termination date, maybe it's March 2025. All of a sudden, that March 2025 date becomes July 2025, and you're agreeing to pay that landlord the additional months of rent at the end of the term. That allows you essentially not to think about the rent for another 4 or 5 years. Will landlords agree to it? You got to ask. I don't know.
Who would, like in that situation, who would be the type of landlord that might agree to something like that? Is it a large REIT? Is it somebody, a mom and pop that has everything paid off in cash? Or is it just how generous somebody's feeling at the time?
This is just guesswork now.
I like that.
I would guess a mom and pop who wants to see the tenants succeed, who doesn't have institutional lenders requiring money coming in to pay their debt coverage. So I think landlords who are the bigger REITs, the bigger shopping centers, might have their hands more tied, because I cannot emphasize it enough. The amount of debt that those landlords are holding and the difficulty that they will have with their lenders limits their options. So that's just guess. So I think those of you in smaller mom and pop landlords, more like strip centers with a few different tenants as opposed to power centers, might have a better shot at that.
Yeah, that's good perspective. Thank you. And then a viable option, that's the best. That's a home run in
Right.
today's environment.
Right.
What would I be okay settling with, basically? And that,
I think, I think for your industry and for the fitness model, before I get there, blending it back in, right? The blending back in of the free rent, so that if you're paying $3,000 a month or $2,500 a month, and you take what's the equivalent of $10,000 of a rent holiday, once things get back up and running, maybe September of this year, the landlord and the tenant will negotiate an amendment that simply amortizes that $10,000, and you're now paying additional rent over the course of the rest of the term. You obviously want to make that as long a payment process as possible, but that again it's a straight negotiation. Landlords will be tied by their lenders. And there'll be an element, I think, of how much pain are you really experiencing on the ground. In certain parts of the country, maybe if you're in Florida or Arizona or Texas, where maybe the virus doesn't maybe it doesn't hit as hard, or maybe it ends sooner. If you have a full plate of yoga classes by August, you could full expect landlords to expect everyone to honor their lease agreement as of August. So I think everyone's just watching and hoping.
What about CAMs? So if we're talking about rent, but then there's also CAMs and triple net,
Mm-hmm.
is that safe to assume a tenant should just pay their share? Because is anybody given any relief on CAMs or triple nets right now?
It's a good question. When I hear rent relief, I think of the entire thing. I think of CAM, I think of real estate taxes. The only reason why landlords would expect people to be paying the carry, those carry costs, would be if you're actually in the space using it. No reason for you to be paying, for the common area lighting of the shopping center when your guests, your invitees, your customers aren't there. So yeah. I would, to make it simple, if I'm a tenant, I ask for everything, and then work your way down from there.
Well, that brings up another point. So if you're just looking, if you're an outsider looking in, what would you say is fair to a location that got shut down, or they voluntarily shut down, like they really had to shut down? Let's say they're closed for 2 full months of business. What do you think is fair out there? Because I don't know that we all look at it from our perspective, but I think it'd be nice to have kind of a third party say, you know what, this is kind of the fair range.
Well, I'll start by saying that I'm not going to tell you that what's fair. I'll first tell you that what is legally fair. And what's legally fair is that tenants signed a contract. The contract is the lease. Your rent is not forgiven under these circumstances. Whether you're being ordered to close by a governmental agency, or whether or not you've made the decision to close because you think it's unsafe for your customers, whatever the case might be. And that's me wearing my landlord hat. But I do want everyone to hear that it's a landlord could take the position that nothing has changed that would allow for or justify free rent, rent abatement at this point. I think to answer your actual question, I think, and I'm sticking with the landlord here, the landlord-tenant courts in New Jersey and New York, where I work primarily, are almost what we call courts of equity, meaning that the judges look at what is fair and equitable as opposed to just looking at what the lease says. Mm-hmm. So I'll take that a step further. Even though the lease might not give tenants much comfort in terms of what the actual words say, I think equity today and tomorrow, and if a judge ever looks at a situation that's based upon the current circumstances, I think equity and fairness will result in rent, in some level of rent forgiveness, at least for April, at least for May, and then let's see what happens after that. But I think a 60-day period now, and I know you had some questions, or people have been asking you questions about does it make sense to negotiate today, or should I wait to see what the federal government comes out at? I think it's a really good question. I don't think you're going to find too many landlords willing to give much more than a wait and see approach. So meaning that, sure, no, we'll say no on April, but we're going to reevaluate at the end of April, So I don't, and I wouldn't advise against negotiating too far in advance, because you never know. Maybe the government's going to come out with a better offer for everyone.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, and to that, like negotiating, and we're talking about like a lease buyout right now, right? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you still talking about lease negotiation of getting out of, or trying to defer some rent?
I'm just talking about a lease holiday. So
okay, lease holiday.
Yeah, I'm talking about basically taking the lease, agreeing between landlord and tenant that all the obligations of that lease are tabled, including rent, for X amount of days. And that I think is a conversation that most landlords we're getting that phone call from, franchises that are both your size, your model, but also a lot of the bigger ones, big boxes, big restaurant chains. So we're seeing it from everyone.
Everybody's asking right now.
Everybody's asking, everybody's creating as many arguments as you can create. I can't operate by law, quiet enjoyment. There's a whole number of
Well, let's talk about force majeure right now then, because that's one of like kind of a misconception out there. People think, well, I've got the force majeure clause, so I should be able to, that gives me some leverage as a tenant.
It's good. I hope your listeners have force majeure language. It's better to have it than not have it. But I'll say it very plainly. Force majeure provides comfort for performance, not for rent. So think about what your performance obligations are in the lease, your obligation to remain open and conduct your business, your obligation to do repairs, your obligation to do build out. Those concepts might have a real argument under force majeure. But you cannot, you can, but you're not legally supported by an argument that says, I have force majeure language, this is an act of God, I'm not paying rent. It doesn't work. So
as much as we'd like it to.
As much as we'd like it to, that's not what it's intended for.
Let's transition. Well, let's just hit some of the comments are, commercial real estate is in a bad place right now. And I think that's the argument that landlords, and that's why they're so freaked out right now, because they are in a bad place. I mean, what do you see happening? We'll just take a quick thing, and then we'll go into negotiating a lease buyout. And is now the right time for that? But what do you see in the future of in the market where, I mean, you and I have been going at it with landlords and trying to save a penny here and a penny there, and we were like met with big no's. You're paying, all this money. What do you see? Put on look in your crystal ball in the future of the real estate prices for tenants.
Well, I think a lot of it depends on Washington. My hope is that we get something from the top down, meaning that, and I know no one likes the big banks, but my hope is that this starts with big banks, with the federal government giving lenders, some comfort, which they then are required to pass down to landlords. And I know it's trickle down, but I don't know that it's going to come directly to the tenants. I think it's going to come from the top, and we'll see some sort of blend. But everyone out there needs to understand that it's a symbiotic relationship here. And so if it's going to be just as bad for tenants in the long run if these shopping centers all close because the landlords have defaulted on their mortgages, because our hope is that come November, come September, maybe I'm optimistic, come July, the economy was good. People, there's a desire and an enthusiasm with real estate, both in the Northeast. I know where you work a lot, in Colorado, in California. We were all waiting for a downturn or a recession. We all saw one coming, maybe a small one. But this is unprecedented, and there's no playbook for it. We're all just hoping that the time period is short, and I think there's a level of optimism that the business communities are going to really energetically get back to it. So I still have some level of optimism, even though the short term is certainly very anxious. There's a lot of anxiety and concern.
Well, let's go to a dark place for a little bit. Just for fun, because I think everyone, I mean, all of us, we're all business owners on this call. And Eric, by the way, I want to get you into this Facebook group as a member. That way you can kind of see what's going on if people have questions for you. But as a business owner right now, I have 3 different scenarios in all the different businesses. You know, best case, like what I'm hoping we'll be open up in May in one of my locations. And then what is likely to happen. And then what is like doomsday. And doomsday is a doomsday. That's where I'm protecting my complete downside. So doomsday for me is, how do I get out of my personal guarantee that I tried to get out of, you know, on the front end with you on these things, but how do I buy out my lease? I've got, I've got a 5-year lease and I've got a 2-year burn that 2 years before you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know.
You can say it better than me. Can you reframe my horrible question?
I look, it's anytime you're looking to get out of the lease, whether it's this time or some other time, it's a question of money, right? I mean, the landlord has stacked your rent along with everyone else's rent, and they have a forecast based upon your rental income for X amount of months or years going forward. We deal with early termination requests sometimes, but whenever we deal with them, it's a calculus of how much, Mr. Tenant, are you going to pay me to walk away from your lease?
Kind of discounted cash flow in a way.
Yeah, it's basically, okay, if you're going to pay me 6 months worth of rent and give me 60 days notice, then you're really paying me 8 months worth of rent, and I have 8 full months to try and get your space released. That's the calculus from the landlord side. Very few landlords are going to want to deal with that, especially given the current dynamic, because the broker world is as topsy-turvy as the landlord-tenant world. All the brokers are equally not sure how they're going to lease up space given the current market dynamics. So I think it's a tough one. I know that there's a lot of folks on this call or listening that would like to look at the current circumstances and throw the towel in. You know, I don't think, just from a public policy standpoint, from what we're all trying to accomplish here, no one wants to see tenants go dark permanently. If you have no other option, then sure, you know, now might be a fine time for you to hang it up and walk away. But I would be very cautious, because I would not tell you that you would not end up getting a lawsuit for both your LLC, your tenant entity, and on your personal guarantee if you tried to do that without getting an agreement from your landlord. And I do not think landlords are going to agree to it. I don't see it because, again, I said this earlier, landlords are concerned. They do not want tenants to go dark. So for you to come to them and say, oh, hey, by the way, I want to go dark and I don't want to come back. I am done here. I am done. This was never a good idea to begin with. I don't like my business plan. I don't like what I'm seeing on the financials. And now we have coronavirus. So I'm going to walk. People can try. People can try. And, you know, I think I mentioned it to you on some conversations we had the other day. Landlords might be cash strapped. So maybe a bunch of money on a lump sum payout might be appetizing to some landlords.
And that's more typical on a mom and pop landlord that probably has it paid off, or, you know, and they just want some cash.
You got it. Yep.
And so but on a big retail center that's probably owned by a REIT or one of the big boys, it's probably a lot less likely.
I think that's less likely, but yeah, and I think the other thing you have to think about whenever I'm working with landlords, remember for everyone listening, that once you start allowing some tenants to walk, you set a really dangerous precedent in your center. if all of a sudden, Cycle Bar is next to Club Pilates and Cycle Bar just closed up shop and pulled all their equipment out. Now Club Pilates wants to do the same thing. It's not something landlords, at least right now, are going to take very favorably. I encourage everyone to try if they want to, but I think a discussion on full long-term rent abatements is probably more palatable.
So I've been thinking short-term rent abatements, but go into long-term for a little bit.
Well,
just longer than short-term.
Yeah, there's not much. I think the pain point for everyone here is measured in time. I think there's a real hope that the summertime is going to bring some glimmers of positivity. And that's why I don't think most landlords are going to venture much beyond 90 days on a discussion right now. But to give you an example, I have some landlords I was on the phone with this morning who they do their own build outs. So they build out for the tenants, and the tenants then occupy based upon a future commencement date. And we're just talking about how easy it is to get construction projects done and how much we can really plan for the summertime. And I just mentioned it because everyone is sort of unable to identify fixed and hard dates of performance right now. So, for long-term rent abatements, I would just say, if you can get a landlord to give you 90 days and revisit it, in June, you've won the short-term battle. Whether you win the war, I can't say, but I mean, that's a good start.
Yeah, that's good. And I have a document. If you guys don't see it in the thread anywhere here, Mike will get it to you, but it's basically, a simple letter on how to ask for that. Pretty simple. Ryan had a question. He said, I'd love to know what your attorney says about being in the middle of a build out, which he is, yep, and the deadline to open or pay rent. He's concerned it would be difficult to finish the space, source materials, and get staff hired. So what would you say to somebody that's in the middle of build out right now?
It's a good
lot question. Of different questions can come, a lot of different things that can come out of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm gonna try not to talk for too long, but there's a lot to unpack. If you are not yet paying rent and you are controlling your build out, one of the first variables I'll bring up is, what is your current state's position on the construction industry? As an example, here in New Jersey, they've been deemed an essential industry. And so construction teams are still authorized to do work all over the state of New Jersey. In Pennsylvania, they're not authorized to do anything. So in Pennsylvania right now, you cannot build out even if you wanted to. Here in New Jersey, you could. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because the force majeure undue delay language in most leases might allow for an argument to be made that your rent commencement date is usually the earlier of maybe 90 days, or pick your number, 120 days, or the date that you finish your build out and occupy your space. Eric, you and I have negotiated that a ton. And the idea there is that tenants from around the country look at the local building departments, look at the local permit process, and they figure out with their architect and their GC, how long is it going to take for me to build this space out? You and I have talked about it in Colorado, but the analysis in Colorado is different than the analysis here in New Jersey or South Dakota. But the point being is that landlords and tenants, when they negotiate the time to build out, are both eyeing what is reasonable under the circumstances to get your space done, get your business operating, so that your free rent period sort of lines up with how long that should take. I say all of that because now that we, in some instances, cannot do our build out, or it's going to be delayed, I think tenants need to make the argument that we negotiated 120 days or 160 days before we have to pay our rent. For all of these reasons, I can't complete my build out, or maybe I just can't open. Maybe I can't open by law because my local state government has shuttered yoga studios or Pilates or restaurants, whatever it might be. And I think the tenants in that position have more arguments to simply not starting rent payment until this situation gets resolved. It's a complicated legal issue. Every lease will read a little differently on it, and my colleagues and I, we've been talking about it internally at the lawyer level. It's really a new issue, and but I think it's one that tenants should really try and take advantage of. It's something you'd probably want to talk to your attorneys about, because it's not simply I can't pay my rent. It's a little bit more of I can't do my build out. This time period clearly assumes the fact that I'd be able to do everything on a timely basis. And then even if I did build out, I can't open my business. So for all these reasons, I don't think the lease intended on me having to start paying rent. So does that all make sense?
Yep. Yeah, it does. And then let's go to the beginning of that. Someone has hasn't started the build out. They're waiting on permits to even start construction right now. One, at what point can you get out of a lease that you've already signed? And then that kind of goes into the other question of just you can just get delay. You should be able to get delays on your everything if you can't get permits because the city shut down. So that kind of goes into the other one. But is there a point, if you have anything to add, please add to it. But is there a point, when are you past the point of no return on actually having to fulfill your obligations on signing the lease?
When the landlord signs the lease.
Yep, and that's it. It doesn't matter.
That's
yeah,
it.
That's the contract.
It's black and white. When pen is to paper, the lease is dated. Everyone shakes hands, and you have that full lease on your desk. You are committed. You are committed. End of story. End of story.
But if you haven't started construction because you're waiting on city permits, that's when landlords are probably going to be pretty generous at that point.
Yeah. Look, I mean, certainly if a landlord is putting in any work on their end, so if the landlord has to deliver something to you and or do anything to spend money to get the space ready for a tenant, I guess that if you're a tenant, if you go to them hat in hand and say, I want out, you have at least a better argument. You have a better shot before the landlord starts spending money. As soon as the landlord starts spending money, then I don't think you have a great argument to begin with, but you have a worse argument once the landlord starts spending money.
Speaking of spending money, I'm waiting on some TIs for my landlord, and I sent them an email with all of the stuff. And of course, I was missing one little thing. I think there was a typo in the email, which is par for the course with me. But let's say, and they came back 1 week later. They said, "Oh, you forgot to dot your I. Why don't you dot your I and get back to me?" And I don't know any landlord that is like really prompt on paying the tenant improvement dollars. Mm-hmm. But and then they said, and we know we're supposed to give it to you in 30 days from the point that you do dot your I. But given this time, it's probably not gonna happen because we're in a different world right now. And that was the end of the email. Like, what happens in something like that? Like, where's it?
There's just as the tenant has no right to withhold their rent for something like this, I don't view landlords as now. If I'll play off your fact pattern. If the landlord needs to get their in-house engineer to review maybe your final lien waivers, or I don't know why they couldn't do it themselves, but if there was some technical aspect of it that required a third-party review, and they legitimately could not get that person in front of the documents, sure. Then they can extend the same way that tenants might be able to extend. The force majeure language works both ways on performance. So the landlord has to perform there to get something reviewed. It's a bad argument. I don't like it. I know landlords make it all the time. I know landlords are slow on coming up with money. I hate to say it, but sometimes that's the way the business world works. When I have had tenants email me asking, what should I do here? They always want to withhold rent. They want to fight fire with fire. And I generally encourage tenants not to do that.
Then that's a good question right there. Let's go into that in a different, let's reframe that question. The impact of risk of not sending a rent check on April 1st. Are we at risk of negative credit reporting, credit damage for being late? And, you know, so that's what everybody's thinking. They're not thinking the TI things like I am.
Yep.
They're just thinking, I'm closed. I don't have to pay rent because I'm closed, and my landlord is just not even emailing me back because they just don't, they know what I'm asking and they don't want to deal with it. They want to get another month's rent. I just might not pay. What are the implications if I don't pay?
Right. Well. So I'll answer directly. I think landlords have the right today in all your leases to start charging you late fees. I don't know that they'd report you to credit agencies. I don't see that with most landlords. And I know that some of the moratoriums that are in place have initially included language that have expressly stated that this is more the residential context, so it doesn't matter for us, but that residential tenants will not be reported to credit agencies and that late fees will not accrue. I think all of that is a wait and see. But to answer your question directly, landlords have the full remedies available to them today. And there are probably a few, what's the word of art I could use without swearing? There's a few hard landlords out there probably who will send default notices on the 15th of April to preserve their rights and memorialize in those letters that you're now paying your 10% late fee on top of your unpaid April rent. And I think tenants should be prepared to get those letters. You absolutely prepare if you don't pay your rent and go silent on your landlords that you're going to get a letter in the mail, because what's going to happen is the landlords are going to call me and they're going to say, what should we do? And every lawyer out there who represents landlords is going to go say, you got to default them. You got to preserve your rights. You know, that's unfortunately the way the game is probably going to get played, at least with all the institutional big landlords. Whether you ever have to pay that late fee, whether you have to pay that interest, I don't know, but yeah.
So we're trying to get our TIs back, and we also would like to ask for rent abatement. Is it a good time to ask for something when you're trying to get something, or should I just pay my rent and ask next month?
That's a good question. Let's if we unpacked it, I always like dealing with things globally. I guess in one way you invite the landlord to apply your TI allowance to your rent payments, which is not what anyone here wants to see happen. That's my only concern, the way you phrase that. But look, there's no reason not to deal with it all at once. The landlords are going to have a short attention span here. I know many of our tenants do not take up what I would call significant square footage, especially when we're talking bigger shopping centers. So, you know, the Whole Foods request is going to get priority over the Yoga 6 request. And we all know that. We all know that. So when you get their attention, I'd make it an opportunity to talk about everything that has to be talked about.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
What do you do if a landlord in response to a request for some assistance asks us to fill out a personal financial statement? Yeah, like I'm asking for a rent abatement and they say, oh, go ahead and fill out a PFS.
I saw that question. I don't see an issue with it. Apart from the fact that I know we don't like giving out personal financial statements. B, I'm not sure what a personal financial statement today is going to really show a landlord, given that the real hurt we're all feeling is happening now into the next few weeks. So I would think what they're looking for is how much money do you have personally to back it up and float it while your business is not able to bring anything in.
Gosh, when I kind of think about it too, I'm like, I don't know that I would want to do that, because you're kind of, if you have a really strong cash position, which if it looks much different than it did when you gave it to them, that's gonna hurt you. If it looks really bad, that's gonna hurt you. If it looks really good, that's gonna hurt you. I just don't see any good news in sending that to them.
Well, and remember, it somewhat depends on what your personal guarantee obligations are. I guess. the tenants on the hook here are the LLCs. They're not your personal finances. We all know that the personal finances that are backing these ventures matter to the landlords.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I would try and get away from providing personal financial statements. As we talk through it, I think you're right.
Mm-hmm. And then especially if you do, and tell me if I'm not an attorney, I dropped out just as I started. Went through orientation, Eric, and I'm like,
We would have loved you. We would have loved you in the bar. Yeah.
I would have been the guy taking it over and over and over. But let's say I am going to send in my personal financials. I would put in big bold letters, do not run my credit.
Do not run my credit, and maybe even put a confidentiality letter over it. Don't release it to anyone either, because it's personal information. I know we give them up when we're getting in the LOI stage and trying to negotiate deal terms, but be careful, tenants, to give anything that you don't have to give under the lease. For landlords don't have a right to ask for that. We of course are asking for things we don't have a right for either. So, it's sort of we're outside the boundaries of the lease at that point. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we I don't know if we answered this question or not. I'm just going to read it. Common area maintenance reconciliation fees. How much extra is reasonable for a landlord to charge when they're unable to control their cost? Does that make sense to you?
Not really. It sounds to me like you have a tenant, and it's Derek. I see the question. It looks like a question from a tenant who thinks the landlord is not managing their property well. You'll need to look at your CAM clause and see if there's words like reasonable in there. But what you're really talking about is an audit. And most tenants negotiate. I know Eric and we negotiate audit rights. So you have the right to audit a landlord's costs. That's spending money in hopes of saving money. It's a tough one. But you leave numbers there, 500, 5,000, 50,000. That's all relative to how big the shopping center is and what type of cost we're talking about. So I think it's very factual. And it's something that he'd want to look at with his counsel and maybe with his accountant.
Any chance that we're going to be able to renegotiate lease terms? It sounds like for me, it's going to be kind of trickle down with what happens. And I guess that's part of another question. Like, Gerald asked the question, should we just kind of hold off before we do too much negotiation to see what comes out of Washington, what kind of relief there is? We have limited information now, or should we try to do a lot of negotiation right now?
I would say this, that I think that it's going to be difficult to get, you need two to tango, right? So I think it's going to be difficult to get landlords to negotiate a full, real substantive changes to a lease today. I see a question here about the impact risk of not sending the rent check on April. If we're getting a rent holiday for a few months, but ultimately this drags out to the end of the year and businesses are really struggling, even if they get to reopen halfway, but maybe there's social distancing requirements that mean that, you can only have 10-person classes rather than 20-person classes. Those facts matter. And if ultimately your business is generating 30 or 50% of what your anticipated gross was, that has to be a discussion with the landlord, but it's not one that you can have today because you don't know what the future is going to bring. So, I hope that answers the question. I think rent and providing fiscal help to tenants today is something that's on everyone's mind, and you're going to have it's going to be receptive. To try and use today to argue for lease changes that are going to affect the deal 2 years from now. I can tell you right now, most landlords are going to look at you and laugh you out of the room. So.
Anybody else have any more questions? We are about ready to wrap this up. Again, going to that dark place, and let's say my business is not viable at the end of this. It was the opposite of social distancing. It was like, we all are in a packed room, and that's the business model. And everybody had to touch each other and spread germs everywhere. And that was the business model. And it's no longer viable in a profitable way. and me as a business owner shift, and I just want to put in a different business into that same location. What is that going to look like? Are landlords going to be helpful with that?
I mean, if at your cost, and if as a means to continue paying rent, and in a world in which we have no idea how dark and terrible it might be in 6 months, absolutely. I mean, I think we don't know how bad it's going to get. And using your example of sort of a dark future, landlords are going to want to preserve their rental income. And so if you want to convert one business to something that you think is more viable given the new world we live in at the end of this year, I think you know, it could work. I had a thought on. I thought you were going to say winding. I was going to say the one thing people should keep in mind is that the exclusives that are in place in a shopping center will limit, what you might want to be able, what you might be able to convert to, right? So
if I know I have $200,000 to buy myself out of the lease, it's going to cost me $200,000. And by the way, it's not just what you're personally what you're personally guaranteed on. You need to look at what you got in TIs and how all that impacts everything as well. But let's say it was a $200,000 lease buyout, and I just want to get out of it. Let's say I just shut my doors. Do I pay all that up front, or can I just shut my doors and pay them every month?
It's a negotiation, but you know the metrics. It's TI money. It's broker commission that the landlord pays. That is what they are trying to amortize back. And depending how far along you are in your lease, the landlord might already have made it all back. If they haven't, you should fully expect those numbers to be added to a really healthy multiple of your base rent payment. And I think landlords will often take a position of a lump sum. Hand me the keys, give me the check, good night and good luck. But you could always try to spread that out over time. You could always try.
Well, I don't think we have any more questions. And I do go into these deep, dark places and look, because I want to limit my downside and know what my downside is. If it's 200,000, it's 200,000. I want to know that. And I'm okay with that, because here's the thing. I think there's going to be opportunity coming up. And there's going to be business owners that are not listening to people like you and like me and making sound business decisions through this process. And some are going to be making emotional decisions, and it's going to eventually hurt them, and their business isn't going to survive. And it's going to be people like me and people like your clients that are going to be able to step in and to walk into some of these leases with them still being the personal guarantor. We can put it into some type of entity, take over that location, and have really good opportunities ahead. So as I ask these go into these deep, dark places, it's not just from a fear standpoint of me. I want to understand what people are going through so I can help buy them out of their franchises at some point, because that will be happening. And that's the silver lining in some ways. And it's also, but not from a shrewd business person. That in my opinion, nothing changes when I buy out a business. I'm not going to screw somebody over to buy out their business. When I buy out a business, I want to get that at the right price, but that's different for everybody in different situations. And right now, some of you listening to this are thinking, I would be happy to walk away from my lease. Well, there's probably going to be some franchisees that will be happy to take over that lease. So I think that is one of the risk mitigation factors that I would look at, is your neighboring franchisees.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, I think there'll be an opportunity when the dust clears for lots of transactions to take place, whether that's leasing or whether that's acquisitions, asset transfers, things like that. Yep. Good point.
Well, this is, thanks, Eric, for coming on. I'll get you in the Facebook group. So if anyone has any questions, would you mind just, answering every now and then? And maybe we'll just come back in. If there's enough questions, we'll just come in and do another Facebook Live to help people. So I appreciate your friendship, all that you've done for me, and coming in to help out the tribe here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's time well spent. I wish all your listeners safety, good health, and good luck in these difficult times. And yeah, I'll make myself available. So we'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Okay.